So hello and welcome everyone. I'm glad everybody could make it here today. Please continue eating your lunches. I just want to do a quick introduction. My name is Caroline Chang. I'm the director of the DC office of the Penn-Wharton Public Policy Initiative. The Penn-Wharton Public Policy Initiative was launched recently to connect data-driven faculty research on issues intersecting with business and the economy with the public policy world here in DC. We have about 85 faculty affiliates across a range of disciplines, and we connect their research with policymakers through a variety of means, including issue briefs and events like these. We are very pleased to be co-sponsoring today's event with the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition, also at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. CTIC is a research center dedicated to promoting scholarly research in technology policy, intellectual property, cyber law, privacy, and related fields. CTIC fosters constructive dialogue on these important issues by hosting a bunch of workshops and conferences each year that bring CTIC faculty and other scholars together with legal practitioners, industry professionals, and policymakers. So with that, I am very delighted now to turn the podium over to Jerry Faulhaber, who's our moderator for today. He's a professor emeritus at the Wharton School and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and he has served previously as the chief economist at the FCC. Professor Faulhaber's breadth of expertise in broadband policy, network neutrality, spectrum policy, and many other issues provides an excellent launching point from which to moderate today's discussion, research and discussion on the very timely issues of internet regulation. So thank you very much. Jerry?
Thank you, Caroline. Being professor emeritus and emeritus of just about everything means I can say whatever the hell I want, so be ready, okay? Welcome to yet another Washington panel on whether our beloved internet is about to be taken over by rapacious monopolists, or by overweening regulators, or by both, or neither. Now, we're all indebted to Christopher Yu for organizing this panel and for being our first speaker. Christopher is my colleague at Penn Law, co-founder of CTIC, as Caroline mentioned. And let me tell you something about Christopher. He has a very unique knack for addressing problems that are very policy relevant, particularly in technology and the internet, and approaching them from a very different point of view than anybody else. And that's what he's done today. The problem du jour, of course, is should we be regulating the internet? And that's what everybody at this table is looking at. This is probably what most of you in this room are looking at, I suspect. But Christopher thinks big picture. And he says the European Union countries have always been regulating the internet. This is not new for them. This is kind of what they've always done. Seeing it at least initially as the follow-on to their regulated monopolies or government-owned monopolies. So we have an extension of, so we have a natural experiment here. How can regulated broadband worked out for them compared to the US? Service-based competition as we have it in Europe versus with mandated access to facilities. Versus facilities-based competition here. Now, this naturally leads us to a ancient and interminable debate about broadband, which is our broadband better, faster, cheaper than theirs, or is theirs better, faster, and cheaper than ours? Christopher's contribution to this, I think, is enormous. He actually puts facts on the table. Isn't that amazing? Somebody actually looks at facts. Can you believe it? And here in Washington, it's amazing. So I can't wait to hear the outcome. Now, the rest of us are all FCC alumni of some sort. Our second speaker is Doug Brake, currently at the Information Technology and Information Foundation and alum of the University of Colorado Silicon Iron's Flatiron program. And he served as a Hatfield Scholar at the FCC, working to implement the Advanced Communication Service legislation. Lastly, Blair Levin is now at the Aspen Institute and serves as the FCC in a lot of ways. Okay, But most recently and most importantly, he was the guy that put together the National Broadband, well, not him, but he was the leader of the National Broadband Plan. Now, there's a lot to say about him, but I think the most important thing from my perspective is the most memorable moment in his history, okay, at least for me, was in the middle of doing the National Broadband Plan. He said the FCC had received over 1,000 comments on the National Broadband Plan. And he, being the honcho, had read them all. And he found nothing of any value in any of them. Okay? Now, all of us know that this is generally true. This isn't a big surprise. Okay? The surprise is that a ranking FCC official actually said this in public. Okay? And that's really unheard of. So he's always been my favorite guy ever since. Okay? You actually did that, didn't you? Yeah, okay, good for you. Now, the schedule here is Christopher will take his 20-minute allotment, and I'll be timing it, Christopher, okay? And then our other two panelists, we will have a discussion, which I will moderate. First they will get up and they'll have a 10-minute allotment each, and again, I will moderate. Then we will have a 20-minute discussion amongst us, followed by 30 minutes of audience Q&A. So think up your questions now, please. Okay, start now, okay? Remember, I'm an MBA professor, and I will not hesitate to cold call on members of the audience, okay, as needed. So please give a warm welcome to Chris Hugh.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for the kind words, and thank you all for being here. Especially like to thank Blair Levin and Doug Brake for being here. Doug at ITF, they did a lot of early work on these international comparisons, which is an incredibly important contribution to how we understand the internet. What's interesting also, this is CTIC's Verse DC event. As Caroline mentioned, we do a lot of the expertise on the faculty range is from patent to copyright to internet governance to privacy, and we expect to be doing this to be the first of many to proceed into the future, and I hope that you will sign up for our mailing list, and we'd be happy to let you know about any events we do on a going forward basis. So what's interesting is, and also we'd like to thank Broadband for America, who provided support for this work. International studies are kind of hard to place, mostly because of language skills, and they made it possible for me to hire a series of research assistants at 8 countries around the world to do the foreign language research that we needed to get done. And so that's been very, very helpful. Interestingly, I'd like all of you to keep an open mind. A lot of people have priors in this space, and I don't know where. I imagine that everyone has different ones. And I do think that the most important thing is to look at real-world data, because data have a stubborn way of informing us, and you can disagree with an argument that's made on theoretical terms, but if it's done on data terms, we either have to engage it in some meaningful way by producing different data or by looking at the flaws in it. This study is based around 2 new studies funded that were commissioned by the European Commission and by the FCC and the NTIA, by the federal government, and I think that they yield a kind of data about broadband coverage which has never really been analyzed before, and so I'm pretty excited about the research, and I'm happy to share it with you today. So if you want to see sort of what the real original animus for this research was started, I don't know, about 9 months ago. It happened when every now and then in the news you see this constant drumbeat, and I've seen it called even a meme a couple times in the writing, about how the US is falling behind. We're 14th, we're 15th, we're 16th. The country that invented the internet is being left behind. And the one I have here is most recently, it was last month or 2 months ago now in the New York Times, but that's only an example of something that happens on a fairly regular basis. When you go to Europe, you hear a very different story. You see things like what Nellie Kroes has said here is, well, we're falling behind the US. And a big problem with this was, there's something wrong with this picture. Both those statements can't be true. Or there's something more subtle going on where if they're both true that we need to understand better. And that what I find people is constantly saying, things like, broadband's great in Stockholm. And I find that cherry-picking individual facts, it's like saying, theater is great in Manhattan. You can't do that. You have to look at it on a really systematic basis across a large range of data to really understand what's going on. And for the first time, we have the data to start to analyze this, looking at coverage, not subscriptions, which is something that every other person has had to look at before because this data simply didn't exist, because you can only do it building from the ground up, county by county, census block by census block, and seeing where different broadband is available. So the two conflicting narratives in the US, we're saying we're behind Europe, Europe's saying they're behind us. But lo and behold, as always happens in this town, a number of policy developments that has thrust this debate really into front and center, which is, in fact, there's an ongoing debate right now about how we should be regulating the internet, and that, in fact, what we're seeing this take place in the backdrop of discussions about Title II reclassification. It's going to come up in the IP transition, the Communications Act rewrite that's currently being pursued by the House Energy and Commerce Committee. All of us must make us confront a fundamental question, which is, which style of regulation are we going to follow? And many people, including as part of, are suggesting we should regulate the internet like a public utility, which is very consistent with how Europe has traditionally done it. And one of the beautiful things about this is we now have, if you will, a real-world experiment that we can actually see how that style of regulation has worked out in Europe and compared to what's going on in the US. So what I would say is we have, for the first time, as I said, evidence on coverage. And that's really important because I'll close with this too. If you look at subscription numbers, there are many, many reasons people subscribe or don't subscribe that have nothing to do with the availability. And so if you really want to look at just the supply side, that is how available is broadband in this world, you really need to isolate the coverage away from the subscriptions. And we have the data to do that for the first time, and they do it in a fairly granular way, broken down by download speed, urban, rural, and technology. I also supplemented it with other data, almost all gathered from government sources. A couple of places I was missing, I had to look at private different sources, and I put some widely cited private sources just for comparison. But the vast majority of what I'm going to present to you is all data collected by the FCC, the NTIA, or the European Commission. And that also, as I mentioned before, we commissioned 8 research assistants in different countries to do some foreign language research, because anyone who's done work like this knows that top-level numbers hide a lot of very interesting detail, and there's some fascinating things happening down below, which you can only get when you look at the actual specifics of what's going on. All right. So that leaves us with 2 key questions. First, is in fact the US behind Europe? And the second question is, what insights does the comparison of the US and the EU experience give us into the decision about whether and how we should regulate the broadband? And in fact, should we return to this telephone-based, public utility, common carriage, to use all the words we use, Title II-oriented system? Or should we think about it as the way we've done since roughly 2005, where we've put it in a separate regulatory category, which has not been traditionally governed by the way we've regulated telephones in the past? So I'm going to put I'm going to say point out 2 slides in this entire deck that if you remember nothing else, I would recommend, these are the ones I'd like you to remember. This is 90% of what I would like you to remember, which is if you want to look at 25 megabit per second coverage, Europe calls it next generation access, which they technically define as 30 megabit, but if you actually analyze their data, they actually collected 25 megabit data, and it compares with the 25 megabit data collected by the US mapping study. You see very clearly that, in fact, as of year-end 2012, which is the latest data we have, 25 megabit per second service was available in 82% of US households and was available in 54% of European households. And what's fascinating to me is if you compare it against 2011 data, the gap is getting wider. It's gone from 25 to 28% over the span of 1 year, the gap, and in fact, you would expect as the US approaches saturation, that gap would get narrow. In fact, it's not. And that is a remarkable finding to me that just talks, when you ask about who's ahead in this one so-called broadband race, or which policies have been more effective in stimulating coverage, it seems to be that the US model is faring very well. Certainly, you can make arguments about whether we're ahead or behind. This provides evidence that, that makes it pretty hard to claim we're behind in terms of 25 megabit coverage. This is the same data for rural numbers. Now, the rurals are a little bit different. The definition of rural in Europe is 100 people per square kilometer. The US is 500 people per square mile. Their US definition's a little bit more generous. But again, we can see here a very, very broader distribution, coverage of rural 25 megabit service in the US at 48% compared to 12% in Europe. That's probably overstating it because of the difference in definitions, but by any estimation, it's going to be, the US seems to be substantially ahead. And by the way, I did, for the academic side, I did statistical tests of this, and every number I'm going to show you is statistically significant. Now, what's interesting is if you get inside which countries are actually ahead of the US, the only ones, if you put the US in the EU rankings, we would be number 6. We'd be behind Malta, Netherlands, Belgium. Actually, it's a 33-country study. They had 4 or 5 non-EU countries in there, so Switzerland's in there, and Luxembourg. What you see are, those are top 5 countries, both in rural and general. These tend to be very dense countries. If you want to see, for benchmarks, population density in the US is 34 people per square kilometer. In the EU, it's about 116 per square kilometer. In Malta, it's 1,327. It's by far the densest country in this study. Netherlands is second. And you see these fairly compact, very interesting countries, often with very high GDPs per capita. And so this is a pattern that we should expect to see. One of the things I'm going to do in the next year is an Asian study. No surprise, guess what? Cities like Singapore, countries like Singapore and Hong Kong have very good broadband coverage because they're essentially cities. And that's, when you have small, compact regions, this becomes possible. But what's even more interesting to me is if you look at the technologies that comprise the next generation build-out, there's many people who believe that fiber is the only answer. Fiber to the home has to be the platform for doing it. What's fascinating is if you break this down by technology, the top 5 study countries were not at the top of the list in fiber. In fact, one was dead last in 30. And many of them are towards the second half. They were all in the top 5 or 6 in both cable broadband and VDSL. And so what this is, you're starting to see a picture is that if your goal is to get 25 megabit coverage rolled out as far as you can, and for example, in the Netherlands, at 98% of the country, historically, based on this point, the European countries have relied heavily on legacy technologies and finding ways to make them part of the mix as well. Many of them are doing fiber as well, but in terms of rural coverage, what they're discovering is that it's very, very hard to deploy fiber to the home in rural areas. And that if you're looking for that kind of coverage, there's probably going to be some sort of mix of strategies, a balanced set of strategies that you're going to have to pursue. This is, setting that aside, where I'm saying fiber is not that important. Many people will flat out say the US is behind Europe in fiber. Simply put, it's not true. We have 23% national fiber coverage as a year into 2012, roughly double what they have in Europe. And then the second, these are the 2 major next generation technologies we're deploying right now, not only fiber to the home, but LTE. We got a huge head start in LTE with 86% at year end 2000. Actually, this is October 2012 data taken from the FCC's wireless competition report. And in fact, for those of you who follow the news, that number has gone up and up and become increasingly competitive because all of the wireless providers are in a race to deploy LTE. And 27%, Europe's actually languished behind for a lot of reasons. I'm happy to answer the Q&A. But they've been slow to deploy a lot of spectrum. They've encountered a number of obstacles in terms of making that go. So me being an academic, one of the things that I wanted to test was these 2 different styles of regulation. That is the European style regulation, which folds it basically into the traditional public utility approach, and the US style regulation, which is really focused on encouraging competition between different technological platforms. And that, in fact, what I did is I used different variables. I'm happy to discuss them. It's in the paper. I don't want to bog down doing this now. The punchline is that, in fact, in all these regressions is that the European-style regulation of requiring people to share infrastructures is negatively correlated at a statistically significant level with 25 megabit coverage. And the US style of promoting facilities-based competition appears to be positively correlated at a statistically significant level with stronger 25 megabit coverage. In other words, every 10% broader infrastructure competition, you get roughly 8% or 3%, depending on which specification you do, increase in total coverage. And so on the first order cut, and the rural data say the same thing. So if you're trying to look at a database decision making about what you can draw from the actual facts, this study, certainly the EU study, provides significant support for the idea. And this is just actually on the EU data because we don't actually do any of these. We don't have a representative measure for public utility regulation to date. On the EU data set, it appears that, in fact, the US approach seems to be working better. This is the second slide I would like. If you're going to remember 2 things from this presentation, this is the second one I would like you to remember. The direct consequence of this is that, in fact, investment rates per household in the US have exceeded those in Europe by roughly 2.3 times, steadily since 2007. And this ties right into the whole idea, the theory behind infrastructure sharing. The problem is anything you build, you have to share with your competitors. The concern has been it will lower your incentive to invest. And that shows up in the coverage numbers, and this is a direct measure of investment studied. It seems to have the exact same effect. And so if we're looking for factual confirmation or disconfirmation, what I would say is that, in fact, that it really sheds light on a series of policy choices we have. One is the Title II reclassification debate that's happening as part of the Open Internet docket. But on a much broader scale, we're talking about the IP transition. We're talking about a communication statute rewrite. And in both those things, we're actually thinking about how much we can learn from the past and how much we'll apply. And what's fascinating is Angela Merkel and Nelly Kroes, who were Angela Merkel, the Prime Minister of Germany, the head of DG Connect, that is the chief regulator in the EU in charge of this, have all openly said, maybe we need to change policy. Instead of worrying about infrastructure sharing, maybe we need to start focusing on promoting greater investment in the individual networks. And in fact, this is a live policy debate there. What's clearest is anyone who looks at the literature and does an honest read will tell you that the theoretical literature on the choice between these two policies is ambiguous. You can tell theoretical stories about why one would be better than the other. What that means to a researcher is that in the end, you must look at data. And you cannot refute a data-based argument with more theory that you just don't believe something, or that there are possibilities that exist. The question is, how likely are the different possibilities? And in fact, what we see here is the data suggested that the US approach of promoting facilities-based competition and not looking at infrastructure sharing and not doing public utility-style regulation has had better outcomes up through year-end 2012. And I'm happy. All data have flaws. All data have limitations. There's an analysis. But that's a conversation I think we can productively have about what the data are really telling us, instead of someone saying, I believe as a theoretical matter, X is true or Y is true. So this is basically what I learned from the mapping studies. And in contrast to the way the debate is framed up, I find these results surprising. I mean, I didn't expect to see such a stark contrast. I mined a lot of other data provided by, in the process of doing this, I looked at a lot of other sources that the EU and the FCC provides, and you end up looking with a lot of interesting things. So one is average download speeds. Both the EU, they finally adopted the same methodology the US does, which is a process called SAMNOS, which is generally regarded as the better of the four methodologies. I also put up 3 other methodologies just because they're widely cited in the press, and also because people among these Akamai is considered the best and least subject to sample bias and other problems. But what I would say is the problem with the EU studies, it doesn't report data on a country level. And the best country level data I have, what you'll see, is reported through Akamai, and that's all covered in the paper. It does suggest that, if anything, we have a mild deficit in terms of download speeds and probably upload speeds. What people in the business will tell you, there's other measures for this of broadband quality. Latency is actually better in the US. Packet loss is actually better. There's a lot of different aspects to this, all of which affect performance. What's interesting to me is, the best measure of how much the network's really doing for you is how much you use it. I mean, it's great to have a very, very fast car, but if you never use it, it's not really doing very much for you. And that, in fact, utilization is the traditional way. I'd actually prefer to turn this into something like GDP, where using broadband could be leisure, whatever, but I'd love to turn it into a real social welfare measure. But for now, we'll let it go with this. And what we discover is that US users, on average, consume 50% more broadband than European users. So they're getting more value, more usage out of the pipes that they have. And that, in fact, even if it's marginally slower or across the other measures it's roughly comparable, what we're starting to see is that, in fact, we are getting more value out of it. And this is true also if you measure it on a household basis. The increase is to about 57%. This is Cisco data. And so what you see is much, much heavier utilization levels in the US than you do in the EU, which says that we're providing real value to US consumers to a greater extent than the EU does. Many people complain about high prices in the US. And in fact, I think everyone would prefer the prices to be lower, and no matter what country they're in, I understand that. The interesting and other people will talk about what prices are. I was talking to the OECD, and they do another study very similar to this. They're talking about how good prices are in Paris. I actually find talking about the prices in Paris to be not helpful, because really, unless we all happen to live in the capital city of the country we live in, that comparison is not really helpful. What you really want to see is nationally, you look at much broader based data. This is the EU study of pricing. They looked at median pricing. They also looked at the lowest cost pricing. Some people will cherry pick the lowest cost, but the median price, someone's buying it or else the median price wouldn't exist, and so it seems to be the better way to do it. What's pretty clear is the US has better pricing at every tier up to 12 megabits per second. So in the lower speed tiers, the adoption tiers, and in fact, if you were to design a broadband policy, this is probably the pricing structure you'd want, which is if you're trying to get people on the network, you charge low prices to the low tiers, and then actually the heavy users who are using the higher end would be charge higher prices. Even at the 12 to 30 megabit range, which is basically what we're talking about, the graph is not very large. It isn't until we get to the higher speed tiers. And what fascinated me is the prices in the higher speed tiers almost map exactly onto utilization. And so it shouldn't be surprising that people who are buying a service that leads to more usage are going to be paying more, and they're going to be concentrated in the higher speed tiers. This was supplemented by a bunch of country studies. And the country studies I found to be really, really interesting, and I find I'm continuing to learn more and more about them all the time. So I'm going to pick a handful that often appear in the press for various reasons, 2 that appear in the press, and 2 that I think that aren't talked about that I think may be more useful models to understand that there's more than one way to be successful. One country that's often measured and mentioned in the press is Sweden. And Sweden is clearly on a fiber to the home strategy. The regulator has got a statement saying they don't believe cable broadband will get the kind of coverage and DSL won't do it. They really want this to be a fiber-led country. They've invested tremendous amounts of it. 40 to 50% of their lines are government owned. I mean, they have literally put public money behind this to make it happen. And that, in fact, they were saying that the hope that this will lead to a very different world. The reality is, for example, they're more urban than the US, even though their population density is actually lower. They're all concentrated in a strip of cities located on the coast, and that if you look at the number of people who live in cities and apartments, it's actually much higher than the US, so it's a much easier country to serve. And that, in fact, it's interesting, there's some real limitations to how fiber can penetrate. The strong emphasis in fiber has led to strong fiber penetration at 46% that has not turned into broad national 25 megabit coverage. In fact, they only achieve 57% 25 megabit coverage compared to a EU average of 54% and well behind the US average of 82%. Even more interestingly, this places them 20th out of 28 EU countries in total coverage. And in fact, the projections say that their NGA coverage, and this is through research done looking at their actual plans announced by the companies, they think they're only going to reach 65% by 2018, which is behind the EU projection of EU-wide of 77%, which includes countries which aren't on a fiber-first strategy. And this should surprise no one. If you're on a fiber strategy, your rural coverage is really bad. It's half what it is in the rest of Europe, and this is a predictable outcome. And so it's focusing on fiber to the exclusion of all the technologies, as Sweden has hurt their digital divide. And what you're seeing is in rural areas, they're simply not getting service, and there is no plan in place really to get them service. France has a similar reputation as an FTTP leader. People will talk about them constantly. It's fascinating. France has a very peculiar history. They believe in strong central control by the government. In fact, phone and telephone systems, you had to actually raise the money yourself, loan the money interest-free to the government, and then they would build out your cable or your telephone system. It's a very peculiar thing. They were very slow to adopt telephone service in the 70s. They were slow to adopt the internet. In fact, when the EU mandated what we call liberalization, that is allowing competition, the French said, we'd rather not have competition in telephone, thank you. So there's a very distinct approach, a very top-down driven approach. And what's fascinating is they said, we're doing fiber, we refuse to authorize VDSL in this country. So the telephone players never did, and in fact, the cable companies had a huge impediment because of state-owned media and there were limitations, and it never grew to be a major technology in France. Well, it's growing now, but there were some real impediments. And it's fascinating. Even though they're often cited as an FTTP leader, the numbers simply don't bear it out. Their FTTP coverage nationally is 7%. And so you can cherry pick a handful of places in Paris and all that. I'm sure they have great fiber coverage, but if you look nationwide, they are well below EU averages. And so I would not choose, I hope for the last time I will hear people talking about France as a model to emulate, because simply put, they're trailing the rest of Europe, and this is not a great situation. Obviously, this translates into very weak NGA coverage. They are the 4th worst in Europe, at 24%, well behind the 54% rates in the EU, 25th out of 28 EU states. And if you look at the projections that the people have based on announced plans, they are not likely to reach the norms available at Western Europe on the strategy they're on right now. There's some evidence they may be rethinking it. No surprise here, weak rural, 1% total rural coverage in France versus 12% in the EU and 48% in the US. And this is what a fiber-only strategy gets you. And that should be relatively clear, that in fact, if you're going to get rural coverage, you need to have a broader notion. Now, what's fascinating is to pick, and I'm not going to talk about all 8 countries because we don't have time. There are 2 countries that have stronger competition from cable because both Sweden and France had weak competition for weak cable. But these countries emphasized VDSL over fiber to the home. Fiber to the home is 1 in 3% in the UK and Germany. Very, very weak, not a major player, and yet they have relatively strong 25 megabit coverage that exceeds the EU average. In fact, it's 70 to 66%, it's a good deal higher, and it's projected, if you look at the analysis, to go even higher through 2018. Because they're able to leverage existing resources in a world where capital has become extremely scarce, they've been able to get more and more out of the existing infrastructure and to move this forward. And that, in fact, they both have solid rural numbers or build-outs right now, and that, in fact, there's reason to be optimistic that this is a viable strategy. There's a lot of different aspects. They're both rather urban countries. Their loop length, that is the length, the number of facilities they have where they can push out VDSL tends to be better in some ways. And I don't mean to, nothing should be cookie cutter. But there is some insights here that we can actually look and say that there are countries who are succeeding on a non-fiber-oriented strategy that we can learn something from, that all countries can learn something from, so they can see what's making that successful, does that apply for our country, and that we can actually find some lessons. So the key takeaways: 1, the US has stronger 25 megabit coverage as of the end of 2012 than Europe. So the question, the horse race questions, very questionable. In fact, we invest more than 2 times as much every year since 2007. And that, in fact, the regression suggests is that imposing public utility style relation is correlated or associated with lower NGA coverage and lower investment, as theory would predict, as one side of the theory would predict, and then does maintaining an approach that focuses on facilities-based competition. And that, in fact, I think there's room for that people who say, oh, it must be fiber to the home, I think are missing an important insight in this, that a balanced strategy that understands that not one technology to the exclusion of every other is the solution, but to understand how we're going to do this. One of the conversations we had during the National Broadband Plan is the last 1% is going to be really, really hard to serve. And it's probably going to be through some form of wireless, if not a satellite solution. And people will say satellite is not as good. We all know that. But for the last 1%, it's going to be extremely expensive to serve them, just because they're just not very hard, easy to reach. And in fact, there's an equity question here, which this is a comment from a blog that I just happen to like. Is it better to provide 75 to 100 megabit service to 80 to 90%, or 1 gig service at 10 to 20%, especially when the people who get the 1 gig student already are getting the fastest service? And in some way, that sort of surfaces the fact that there are trade-offs here that we have to decide. I'll close with this one thought. This is all about the supply side, how much broadband is available. One of the focuses of the National Broadband Plan that Blair led is that, in fact, people adopt for a wide number of reasons, and availability is only part of the question. And that if we just focus on if we believe if we build it, they will come, they won't come. That's what this slide says. 86% coverage in the US, 17% adoption. There are plenty of people who have broadband available to them who are choosing not to adopt. Now, it's interestingly, everyone says, okay, it's not availability, it must be price. What you start to see is if the Pew Research does a very good set of studies, it's not price. In fact, in the conference call that we were preparing for this, Jerry said he found a published study that 1/3 of non-adopters would not buy high-speed broadband at any price because they don't see the value. And so that much of part of this has to be not on the supply side, but on the demand side. How do we show people, create value for people? And that if you just simply build additional bridges to nowhere, you won't get service unless you actually attend to the fact that we need to change the debate. Instead of worrying about horse races and who's ahead of whom, really understand why people adopt, how they adopt, take a more holistic approach to understanding that. Because, in fact, having you adopt but not actually use it for value to you is not creating benefit for our society. And the real issue here should be about jobs, productivity, and people fulfilling their lives. And that has more to do with how they use the internet than the fact that they have a gigabit adoption. And so when I hear people say, we need gigabit symmetrical fiber to the home, I would like to have that conversation on the basis of data to understand what are the use cases for gigabit. And I hear a lot, 8K television, people throw out these ideas. Let's actually do adoption studies about what this is likely to be. And in fact, is 8K going to go the way of what we've seen 3D television to do, which was the next big thing that never went anywhere? And so there's some actual real studies. We can have a conversation, because without data, you get people's opinion and their faith in different technologies about their vision of how the future is going to go, which, as you know, anyone who's been in this business long enough knows people's visions are wrong as often as they're right. Thank you very much.
Is this thing on here? Can you hear me? Good. Thank you, Christopher. Excellent point. I love the point at the end about adoption versus coverage, because one of the things we can do well in Washington and as regulators is to mandate coverage, mandate build-outs. What we can't do is mandate people to use it. So we don't seem to have very good solutions for that, and perhaps it's time we start looking at what the problem is not the problem we would like it to be. In any case, my 2 cents there. I'd like to now turn the podium to Doug.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks to Professor Yu and PPI for having me here. It's a real honor to be up here with these guys. As Jerry mentioned, I'm Doug Brake with ITIF. ITIF's a public policy and education institution focused on how innovation of all types can help spur productivity and economic growth. So Chris's introduction really framed the discussion as a response to a sort of common narrative that I think is out there in the press. It seems like every other week there's a new infographic or a new story that talks about how the U.S. is falling behind. So the narrative generally goes that the U.S. is falling behind in broadband speeds, we don't have fiber to the home, and telecom companies are rolling in profits while consumer prices continue to soar. So ITIF has actually taken a close look at this narrative. February of last year, we published a major report called The Whole Picture that took a close look at this narrative. And we found, very similar to Professor Yu's paper, that very little of the narrative is accurate. So I'd like to run through a few of the key points of our findings. I hope that it usefully complements Professor Yu's presentation and not simply echoes it, though I think some of that is inevitable. So first of all, these comparisons are really quite hard. As Professor Yu pointed out, it's all too easy to cherry pick data from high-performing networks in very dense, rich European countries and try to compare them to costly, sprawling networks of America's suburbs. That said, the data really is clear. Christopher's work with this new mapping data, absolutely a very extreme contribution to this debate, but I think that Akamai's reports make it just very simple and clear. We consistently rank in the top 10 in both average speed and average peak connection speed, and we're improving, not falling behind. United States consistently shows above average year-over-year improvements. Furthermore, looking at data at the state level, if we were to compare individual states with international countries, which often in terms of geography, topography, and density is a much better comparison, America sweeps 6 out of the top 10 places. Second, on the point of pricing, as was mentioned, pricing in America is uniquely very progressive, with introductory pricing levels being really quite low. ITU has put us at the 3rd best introductory prices for broadband. With it increasing, at increasing rate and higher broadband speeds costing somewhat more than in European countries. I submit that this is exactly the sort of schedule that we'd want to have for broadband. If we need to be able to recuperate those costs that go into building out expensive networks, it makes sense that we put that burden on those who are most willing to pay for high-speed broadband. So I think a progressive rate structure makes absolute sense. It enables us to start bridging the digital divide and bring on new people to broadband at a lower introductory rate. Third, I think a very important point is on fiber. The narrative talks about how we're falling behind in fiber. There's no fiber to the home. But I think it's important to note that for the last several years, American firms have continued to purchase more fiber than all of Europe combined. American contribution to global broadband infrastructure investment has remained steady at roughly a quarter of the world's total, and that's even considering the fact that this global numbers have continued to grow. Another very important point, I think, is that we have the technological capability to continue to squeeze more and more throughput from existing infrastructure through the copper lines and the cable infrastructure that already exists. First of all, cable's DOCSIS system, the DOCSIS 3.0, has shown significant improvements in speeds. DOCSIS 3.1 will continue, I think, very radically increase those speeds. The same is true in DSL. DSL showed a significant improvement in broadband speeds. G.fast offers a potential for extreme increases in that as well. And of course, we'd be remiss not to mention the actual fiber new entrants in many cities throughout America. On the issue of profitability, our report found that American broadband providers are no more profitable than elsewhere. In fact, on average, incumbent firms in Europe take in significantly more profit than those in the U.S. Furthermore, on average, American firms have higher capital investment to revenue ratio than those abroad. Also, American firms are closer to advertised speeds. Sam knows data contracted by the Federal Communications Commission has put data on America's average connection speed at 97% of the advertised rate. This contrasts sharply with those in the European Union. The European Union Commission has often complains that Europeans get 75% of their advertised data rates. All of this is in spite of the fact that European countries supplement their broadband offerings with significant subsidies. Adjusting for GDP and population, Sweden has provided $31 billion, Latvia $82 billion, Finland $3.9 billion, Italy $7.7 billion, and Luxembourg an astounding $126 billion. So I think this shows that our success, combined with Professor Yu's paper, is likely due to high rates of intermodal competition. By measurements in our report, America has the third highest rate of intermodal competition in the OECD, behind only Belgium and the Netherlands. I think a significant finding in our report that is echoed in Professor Yu's presentation is that one place that we do have significant room for improvement is in adoption. Rates of broadband adoption in the U.S. compared to about average in Europe. I think that there's room for significant improvement. And as Chris mentioned, this is not about coverage, or coverage is not the limiting factor in adoption rates. That you saw the Pew statistics, that is largely about interests and people's views about whether or not broadband is relevant to their lives. That's a limiting factor in adoption. So I think that this requires a major rethinking of how we approach this problem. This is not about broadband coverage. I wanted to say a few words about Ookla's, the speedtest.net data. I think, at least from what I see, a lot of the news stories that we see about U.S. falling behind in broadband speeds consistently cite the data from Ookla. And we believe that Ookla's data is very strangely not in conformance with many of the other reports, all the data that Chris has looked at, as well as the Akamai data, other data presented by OECD and ITU. There's some strange self-selection problems. People usually turn to the speed test website when they're having problems with their connection, which I think can skew the test in strange ways. And from what we've seen, it appears to be very biased against geographically large countries like the United States that gives much higher speeds to smaller countries. So before turning to Professor Yu's paper proper, I think it's worth pausing and again reiterating that how wonderful an opportunity this is, that we have a very rare natural experiment where Europe and the US chose two different regulatory models, and we now actually have the data to look at this experiment and figure out, when we can control properly for different variables, understand which is better. I think Professor Yu's findings are very consistent with what ITIF found in our report. The new data from the mapping studies is absolutely a significant step forward in this debate, and I think, to my mind, settles the debate. It's the first in-depth analysis of this data that I've seen, and so I think the findings of this paper are really significant. Also, I think the sections of Professor Yu's paper that focus narrowly on the effects of intermodal competition on investment are a great contribution. I think it's sort of intuitive that if you require local loop unbundling, you'll see investment rates decline, but when you can control for external variables and actually look at those two issues specifically and quantify the level at which local loop unbundling decreases investment, I think that's an excellent contribution. Also, the case studies, as Professor Yu mentioned, the issues from France, where you see a regulator choosing to eschew a particular technology and the effects that has on broadband coverage, I think we can learn a lot from. The implications, I think that we know now that we are generally on the right track with the general framework of a light touch regulation and reliance on intermodal competition. I think it's fair to say that it's time to start moving away from this debate of simply where we are in comparison, where the U.S. is versus Europe or versus Asia. And the whole rankings process, to my mind, is a bit silly. Everyone's got to fall somewhere. When you look at the actual numbers, everyone's really quite close in the top 10. And so when you rank, based on just decimals of different average speed, I don't think it's very helpful to decide where we rank in the debate. I would be remiss not to mention, I think we want to avoid the tendency for a lot of telecom policy panels to descend into net neutrality, the black hole of net neutrality. But I think a strong indicator of this report is that we should avoid Title II, avoid opening the door to this sort of local loop unbundling, and advance sort of general policies of technological neutrality, that it doesn't make sense to try to pick which technology is best going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doug. Are we on here? Thank you very much, Doug. Well, we've heard two people who told us sort of the same thing. Now, Blair is going to straighten us all out.
No, actually, I'm really tempted to just get up and say, I wrote the National Broadband Plan in 2009. Obviously, since then, the United States is just doing awesomely well. Thank you very much. Sit down.
Thank you, Blair.
You're welcome. But instead, I think I'll say a couple of other things. Let's start with a pop quiz. Which activity is more productive? Looking at oneself in the mirror and asking, do these jeans make me look fat? Or going to the gym? At this point, you have two thoughts in your head. One is the latter, duh. And the second is, what does that have to do with broadband? Actually, nothing. But it's the logic behind your thinking, which is that focusing on actions to improve one's condition is better than wondering about how one's condition appears or how it is relative to others. And that's why I'm actually not going to address many of the questions raised by Professor Yu's excellent paper on international broadband comparisons. It's not that the paper isn't interesting, it's not that it's not relevant at some level, but ultimately it's a distraction. Now, ironically to me, it's very similar to another excellent paper by Professor Benkler of the Harvard Berkman Center that also reviewed international comparisons. It was submitted to the National Broadband Plan. It came to pretty much exactly the opposite conclusions on almost every issue. I look forward to a debate between Yochai and Chris. That'd be a lot of fun. But many criticized, we didn't actually cite it very often, and many criticized us for that. But the truth is the same. I'm using the same logic, which is they address where we are, but they don't address the more critical question of what to do to get to where we want to be. Now, consider the long history we have of debating broadband comparisons, which both Chris and Doug mentioned. Now, one amusing point is that the data on the topic is constantly shifting, yet the positions of most parties never change. Those who 5 years ago said we rock are still saying it. Those who say we sucked 5 years ago, I believe, are still saying that. It's this kind of logic which, if applied to your portfolio, would result in you owning a lot of Nokia and BlackBerry stock, which I don't recommend. But the serious point is, with all international comparisons, they are inherently backwards looking. Wherever we are today, it is a function of decisions made years, if not decades ago. Well, looking at those reveals how rankings don't provide much insight going forward. For example, I happen to think our position with LTE today is actually pretty good. There are lots of different reasons, largely private sector reasons, but there are some public sector reasons too. Among them, the 1997 decision to free up spectrum by accelerating the DTV transition from 30 years to 10, about a decade, and also to equalize wireless with wired in terms of terminating access charges. A debate at that time on international rankings would have provided no insight whatsoever as to what the right decisions on those topics would have been. And indeed, international rankings would have been deceptive because Europe actually led at that point, which had to do with the way the GSM standard versus the TDM standard, or the mixed standards that we used in the United States. Further, international comparisons, in my experience, are like a watch that a runner might look at during a race, something of a distraction. If we want to look forward, we should be asking, what do we need to do today to lead in the future? And my answer, step away from the mirror, go to the gym. And in this case, the gym are the 4 strategies embedded not just in ours, but in pretty much every one of the 139 countries that have done national broadband plans. Build fiber deeper, use spectrum more efficiently, get everyone on broadband, and use the platform to improve delivery of public goods and services. And so here's the bottom line. Assume that those who think we're doing great are right. What do? Those same 4 things. Assume that those who think we're doing badly are right. What do? Those same 4 things. So the right debate is, what do we do about those 4 things? Now, I could talk about any of the 4 of them, and I think Christopher's right. Probably the most important debate for the country is the adoption debate. Maybe we'll talk about that more later. And actually, on the 1-year anniversary of the plan, I said, well, I was proud of some of the things we said about adoption. That was where I thought we were most efficient, and talked about where I thought what we had missed analytically and how it was important to move on. But I'm going to talk today, because that's the topic really raised by Christopher's paper, about driving fiber deeper. And whether you think we need fiber to the home, even if you're doing wireless, you need fiber deeper. When we were doing the plan, we couldn't actually figure out a federal policy that we thought had political viability and would work to drive fiber deeper. Or we had some ideas, but I won't go into those. But out of the discussions we had came the Google Fiber project and the Gig.U project that I lead, which is a consortium of research university communities seeking to upgrade the networks in their communities. So are those things having an impact? Well, I'm a lot more optimistic than I was a year ago. A year ago, there was a Wall Street Journal article in which the Time Warner Cable CEO said, no one wants faster speeds. Time Warner Cable just announced it's tripling their speeds with no price increase. Oh, but guess where? In Austin, Texas, where Google, AT&T, and a CLEC named Grande are building fiber deeper and have announced plans to offer a gig at an affordable price. In that same article, the Cox CEO said the company can't upgrade to offer a gig because it would cost billions and billions. 2 weeks ago, Cox announced it was upgrading to a gig in its entire region, but guess where they were starting? In areas where Google or CenturyLink have already announced projects for offering an affordable gig. AT&T is talking to 100 communities about an upgrade. They correctly credit Google Fiber, which is itself discussing doing a gig in 34 new communities, for helping spark both a competitive dynamic, but also a change in the attitude of various cities about how to lower the cost of deployment. I was in Illinois last week helping to announce another gig project in Champaign and Urbana, the towns that surround the university there. I could point to a number of similar efforts in places you haven't heard of, all of which have been triggered by the idea of driving fiber deeper. Now, this leads to a small point, a big point, and a meta point. The small point is the current debate over where we are does not include any of the news I just mentioned. So I think that wherever we are, we may be a lot better in a couple of years. But I can also envision how scenarios could work that we would be worse. So as Tom Wheeler told the cable industry, put away your party hats. We have not passed an inflection point at which the next American wireline upgrade is soon and irreversible. But unlike a year ago, there are positive signs on the visible horizon. The big point is none of these advancements were assisted by the debate over where we are. They resulted from a conversation about how to do better. Yes, sometimes at the many city council meetings I've been at, there's been a reference to Seoul or Stockholm. And I suppose that John Oliver's epic rant last Sunday night mentioning that the U.S. ranks in the mid-20s behind Estonia on broadband speeds might inspire others to act. He certainly succeeded in crashing the FCC website, which is ironic on so many different levels. But the reason why cities are leading the upgrade cycle is because, frankly, their leaders are focusing on the right question of how to make progress. Unlike the person looking at the mirror and asking how they look, they are telling their cities, let's get to the gym. Let me close with the meta point, which is we have a choice. Now, Christopher did a great job, but when we think about policy, we can focus on the easy or focus on the important. Measurement from a policy perspective is relatively easy. Constant improvement is hard. The international chapter of the National Broadband Plan very specifically did not focus on measurement. It focused on process, on those countries that understand the progress is not created by a press release. It is a function of having ideas, testing those ideas, and course correcting. Now, I asked the then chairman of the FCC when we were doing the broadband plan for an annual review of the broadband plan, not for the sake of bragging about what we got right, but actually for determining what we got wrong. I was told by his PR guy that that was a bad idea, as it would give space for people to criticize the plan, and I said, well, that's going to happen anyway. I just wanted a forum for smart, actionable criticism. As some folks know, the chairman's PR guy was much more influential with the chairman than I was, and such a review never occurred. Much more could be said about that, but suffice it to say here, I think the FCC's broadband policies would be better if there was a sense of the long term, a willingness to engage in a debate about how best to implement the four strategies, how to make, as Christopher said, the trade-offs, because there are a lot of trade-offs, and a commitment to course correction. Now, that debate's harder, but as the cities, not the national government, but the cities are showing us, it does have the benefit of leading to an era of broadband and bandwidth abundance, which, rather than a static relative measurement with Estonia, ought to be the North Star of our policy. Thank you.
Well, Blair has sort of taken away the first question I was going to ask. But I will ask it of the other two. Blair has already mentioned, and that is to say, we seem to have better broadband in the U.S., but my question on this, as was Blair's, is a simple one. Is our policy going to be different depending on what the answer is? In other words, who cares and why? So let me throw this to Doug first.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure this is on. I tend to agree that it's time to start asking these questions of how we move on versus just having this simple debate. But I do think it's a significant question of whether or not we are behind, mostly just because this narrative that's generally put forward that I went through is put forward in defense of radical changes in our regulatory structure. And I think that the evidence that we found in our report, the evidence presented by Professor Yu, shows that those sorts of radical changes are really not warranted. I think that what is going on in Blair's project at the city level of looking at ways to dramatically reduce deployment costs, that's a different question. I don't think that I agree that that's a worthy pursuit, and I don't think that those sorts of subtle questions are often caught up in this overall broad narrative of a radical change to common carriage. I think it's significant in that we shouldn't be deciding upfront what sort of technology should win. I think that when we investigate these sorts of local practices to lower cost of deployment, that these should be open to any sort of technology that would want to utilize these on a local level. I also think a significant point is that this is very real data that's relevant for the Europeans. This would represent a significant encouragement for a significant regulatory change for them. So I think it's relevant. Blair's point very well taken, that time to get to the gym, that there are reasonable, steps that we can take to move this forward, whether or not we are ahead or behind. But I do think that it's very relevant and useful data.
Let me just jump in, Doug. I think you mentioned that you found the Europeans are actually thinking about this. Could you elaborate more on that? Change in regulatory environment? It was Doug? Yeah?
No, was it a question from you or Doug?
I think it was Christopher.
I think
You were
I'm
the
the
one.
one that was
Okay,
doing that.
okay, go ahead.
Well, there's an active debate going on that Commissioner Crows, who's the head of DG Connect, has at least floated the possibility. Right now, it's been a given that they will unbundle fiber. Their method of calculating it makes that almost an inevitability. And what you're seeing is a stark lack of investment in fiber. And the DG Connect is floating the possibility, usually extracted in some regulatory price in some other dimensions, such as lowering copper or reimbursement rates or doing different things. But it is something they're trying to decide because they look at not only the fact that their investment numbers are really bad, revenue is declining among EU providers. And that's just a shocking fact to me in an IT-driven world. In the US, revenue across the sector is increasing. And there's something very bad going on in Europe. And in fact, I think that they are understandably questioning the premises of some of the things that they're doing. What I love about the idea is what Blair said, is having ideas, testing ideas, and course correction. And in many ways, what I see looking at the study is, oddly enough, where I'm learning the most from is not in the numbers I presented to you, but in the details of the case studies. It's actually given me tons of new ideas about how different strategies have gone. And many of them we wouldn't want to emulate. So Denmark, for example, the cable industry is owned by the telephone incumbent. That's something that was widely true in Sweden and Germany, France, and a bunch of other countries, which they were required to divest them. And they've actually been able to get very, very strong NGA coverage. And in fact, what they've seen, interestingly, is fiber competition from energy companies. And so all of a sudden, you start to see scenarios that start to make you wonder about how things are going and experimenting with new ways of doing it. What I do is it makes me inherently suspicious of people who are really focused on one strategy. Spain is on a fiber strategy, but they studied and they realized that they're getting fiber in the big cities, cable in the medium-sized cities, and in the small cities, it's all DSL. And we're seeing new DSL. We've wrung so much more bandwidth out of that little twisted pair than we ever dreamed possible, and we're getting new technologies that are pushing 50, 100 meg, and in those communities, it very well may be the only thing. The one other takeaway, though, is how do we create a world where we permit this kind of experimentation to happen? And I think about 10 years ago when we saw Fios and Uverse take radically different approaches in terms of technologies. How we do it is by having entities being free to pursue different avenues. And what I think is what my takeaway from Google and GigU and these different examples that Blair talks about is that competition works. A real facilities-based competition is what's driving this forward. And Google has come up with a radically new business plan. That if we approach this as the way we approach the telephone industry or the cable industry, we would not have permitted. And I think that we as a country are the better for it, and that it has become a success path that other people are following, and that in fact the kind of testing and course correction that Blair talks about depends on companies having the freedom to try things that are different and not like we did before, which is not the way we've traditionally regulated the telephone network. And I think that the idea that we should then fold it back in is a problematic one.
Blair, you want to add anything to this?
No, except to say that I agree, and part of what we're trying to do with Gig.U is to create kind of that space for experimentation so that not only would that serve Google, but would serve incumbents who want to try things. What's interesting is when I went to the incumbents 3 years ago when we started, they were all sympathetic, but they weren't that interested. Now they're a lot more interested. So I think whereas giving them the free political space is a valuable thing, it was really the competition from Google Fiber that has inspired more of the AT&T and the Cox and the CenturyLink activities.
Well, new business models are risky, especially when you think about Fios. You had to put $24 billion on the table to get it going. The second follower, once the business model has been validated, is a tremendously beneficial world. So to take a very strange example, my wife worked for General Mills. She sold cereal, Lucky Charms and Trix. Kellogg's was their main competitor. And General Mills was going into Europe where they had no business, and they had to explain to people, this is for breakfast, see? I mean, they had to develop a market, which from a business standpoint is very, very expensive and very hard to do. They were begging Kellogg's to come with them, to bear the cost, because their nightmare is that they'll bear the cost to develop the market, and the second player comes in, and now that if you lose, fine, you eat all those losses. If you win, we'll come in behind you, and we don't have to bear the risk. And you see this world where I think that having people make it easier for them to take those kind of risks has tremendous benefits for us as a society.
Hi, let me get back to an issue we raised earlier, and I think this needs some more focus. Christopher's study was really based on broadband coverage of how many households get broadband. And this is the right thing to do because this is basically all we can do from a public policy perspective is to order guys to go out and put fiber in the ground. But in fact, the startling fact about broadband on both sides of the Atlantic seems to be only 70% of households that have it available actually take it. Now, we've been sort of talking about this, but nobody's been listening ever since the National Broadband Plan. I think Blair brought this up at the time. Nobody wants to talk about it because we don't think we can do anything about it. It's very, very hard. And again, let me remind you, recent studies show that a third of the non-adopters would not take it if it were free.
That's not quite what it is. A third said they would not take it?
Third of the
Okay,
non-adopters, yeah,
right.
okay.
So it's like, that's like 10%.
Of
But for
total,
two,
yeah.
and just to, you said price is not a factor. I think you're slightly overstating that. Price is a factor for some.
Yeah.
It's not, relevance is the leading factor, but price is, I think, number two. And relevance, if you think about how people actually think, relevance is always kind of a price ratio. It's a value proposition. So, and I would just, I should wait for you to ask the question, but I would just note, well, actually, when we were doing the plan, I gave a speech about this that was talking about how television has a far higher level of penetration, including multi-channel video television, which people pay for.
Mm-hmm.
And, but let us not forget, the internet requires a level of literacy. It requires real literacy, I mean, the ability to read, to really be useful. It also requires certain things like typing skills. It requires, the ability to search and understand those things. That's very different than television, which is a totally passive activity. So there's a lot of reasons why the number might be lower. It is a different medium. But having said that, and we can chat about that, I think there's a lot of things the country can do. We just are not choosing to do them. We're choosing to let the private sector, frankly, lead the way, whether it be Comcast Internet Essentials or what Google is doing with their basically free offering.
And what success are we having with that?
Well, I would say, first of all, this is one where both the Comcast Internet Essentials and Google have been criticized for different reasons, and I would defend both programs. I think they're worthwhile. As to which will work better, my guess is frankly Google will work better, but for complicated reasons. Going to what happens in the community when Google runs a rally to build out. But I'm perfectly willing to wait for a couple years. The Internet Essentials program, frankly, it was not that successful at the first. I completely admire Comcast's leadership for actually looking and hiring people to tell them why it wasn't working and then making certain adjustments. But I think we are putting way too much on that company and on Google to solve the problem. This is a public problem, and the reason I say it's a public problem is you actually cannot be a fully participating member of either the economy or society without access to broadband. Now, if you have it in the library, that's great. If you have it at McDonald's, that's okay. But as a practical matter, you're really going to need it pretty much ubiquitously in the home. And the cost of running a society is greater if we don't have everybody on. Government is the last institution that will have to run two platforms, an analog platform and a digital platform. And there are enormous costs associated with running a paper entity. Every private sector enterprise I know, and the ones that I've worked with, I've spent most of my life in the private sector, are fundamentally switching to a non-paper platform. And there are lots of reasons for that, including the way you improve performance by having it electronic data, right? The government needs to move to that platform and as quickly as possible, and yet we're not really thinking that way.
Doug, let's refocus it and ask you to, what can we actually do in a public policy context about this? I mean, as Blair says, we have to do something. What is it? What do you think?
I agree. It's a tough public policy problem that I think is fundamentally to be solved on the local level. I think it takes local nonprofits, maybe even going door to door to or set up literacy sessions, computer literacy sessions, to try to educate folks on the value and simply how to use a computer. I think that's an important first step. So I think it's a fundamentally local problem that could be, I don't know, perhaps encouraged on the federal level by best practices or something like that. But yeah, I think it's a difficult public policy problem that isn't best solved through a federal program.
What do you think, Christopher?
I think that there's room for, what strikes me is we do a lot of this pretty well. In senior centers, the classes about how to use the internet are packed. And in fact, what's shocking me, I spent some time in Japan recently. They don't use the internet, seniors don't. And it's pretty shocking. You go to a government office, you fill out something in triplicate on paper, and someone sits there and keystrokes it in. And this is an advanced Western, industrial economy, and they just have not adopted the kind of government services in the ways that I think are beneficial. So I think that one point we have to remember, though, it's not just what we can do. We have to make sure there's certain things we have to make sure not to do. And the risk I have in the current debate is really encapsulated by the Title II reclassification debate, is traditionally we've regulated telephone networks as with a one-size-fits-all regime, where you publish a tariff and everyone has to get in. And then we had businesses who wanted, I don't need as much of this, but I need some of that, and they wanted to actually vary from it. And under the traditional form of telephone regulation, you can't do that. Allow going to a proceeding and getting special permission and do these other things. And it becomes very, very cumbersome to try the kinds of experiments that we've seen work so well. And in fact, what I see in a lot of the debate is a backward-looking view that says the internet has always run a particular way. And we need to preserve that and make sure it runs that way in the future. And just like they say in financial advice, past results do not predict future performance. Or as what a scholar would say is, unless the controls are the same, don't expect the same outcomes. It's just true. Most of that world existed in an email and web-based world where basically you were transferring files from a server to your computer. And when there are file transfer programs, I can go into a lot of detail. It's pretty simple, and it's not as technically demanding in terms of bandwidth. It's mostly text. So the video-based, interactive-based world of applications has become so much more heterogeneous, and that we're asking the networks to do things that we never dreamed it would have to do. A one-size-fits-all approach to regulating it, saying the internet should look in a way that I just see as the way, is counter to what I see in this paper. It's the heterogeneity, it's the experiments, it's the trial and error, it's the learning and course correction, and that drives it forward. And I'd like to make sure that not just what we do, but what we don't do is to put a regime that will make that harder to do.
This is a moment for a brief commercial announcement. I don't actually want to talk about net neutrality and classification because next week I work at the Aspen Institute. We're having a debate featuring Tim Wu and Jim Ciccone of AT&T. I'm also on the panel. I doubt I'll say a single word. I certainly hope not. It should be very amusing. That's on the 11th for those of you who wish to attend. And that will be right on the topic. I will simply note what has struck me about the debate is the proponents of net neutrality believe Title II does a number of things it does not in fact do. And the opponents of net neutrality believe that Title II does a number of things that it does not do. But here's the one thing Title II does. It raises lots of questions. And so it should be a very fruitful debate.
Okay, well, if we can now end our discussion of network neutrality. Okay. Let me sort of add one thing when we talk about how do we handle the demand side of this, and part of the story we're getting at is that there's certain people that can't handle it for one reason or another, in which case it seems to me we should be looking at our educational system. I, for one, I'm a great admirer of our country's community college system, which has actually done amazingly well at educating folks who might otherwise not be educated in things like how you use the internet. We have a home in Delaware. It's near Delaware Technical Community College, where in fact you can go and take a course for free on how to use your cell phone. Well, I think maybe we need more of that. That's a good place to look and maybe to fund there. Let me ask another question here. The Christopher's study aims at the impact of regulation on price and coverage of broadband generally in the EU. And European regulation of broadband looks a lot like, pardon me, Blair, Title II regulation in the U.S., particularly in mandating unbundled access of broadband loops. Now, we went through a thing about mandated unbundled access, but for telephone loops. Do you remember that? Okay, that didn't go so well. But this is not an issue in the U.S. We don't do that anymore, okay? Regulation of the internet is focused on network neutrality and, more recently, internet interconnection. Now, if we conclude from Christopher's study the sort of big picture conclusion that regulation a la the EU is not so great, does this apply to regulation a la US, meaning network neutrality and internet interconnection? Is there a tie-in here? If you kind of go below the big picture level, it looks like they're not too connected. So why don't I give that to you, Christopher?
I think there's a pretty clear connection. So certainly on the interconnection side, one of the proposals that was put forward at the ITU by the European telecom network operators, their trade association called ETNO, was to fold internet interconnection into the settlement plan we use for international phone calls. And it has a very distinctive pricing mechanism which has found its way into the proposal of the Open Internet Order, which is sending party pays. And I don't want to go into the huge details of this. There's a very complicated literature on that many people, I've been involved in some debates online with people I don't think really get it, but there's no question that if you folded the broadband internet interconnection into the telephone system, that would be the default rule, and the burden would be on you to move off of sending party pays. That is not the principle we use now. And so all of those things puts the burden of proof on someone who wants to deviate from the existing telephone system, regulatory system, to show that it would create benefits to move away. And the burden of proof in the regulatory system always would rest on the person that's trying to do something different. And especially if you're trying to prove a negative and you have to show affirmative benefits, that's very, very hard to do. And it puts the thumb on the scale, in my opinion, against experimentation, which is one of the great virtues of the system we've had. Specifically, that's the interconnection side. In the network neutrality side, on some level, they're asking for non-discrimination within networks. They're basically asking for a treatment that is relatively similar. That is very much part of the traditional common carriage or Title II regulation of 201 is rates that are just, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. And that, in fact, that is the heart of what the network neutrality debate and the open internet debate is about right now. So I think that it's very clear that that would have implications because it's pretty, there are some fascinating things where it's not just in the network. We're also seeing people doing different topologies. They're putting routers in different places. They're putting data centers in different places. I'm working on a book looking at cloud. I actually got someone, a geographer, to look at how the access to cooler temperatures and electric power has a huge impact. I mean, it's just a very different world we're living in now. And that my worry is that folding it into the old world where we take the old books off the shelves and apply them reflexively is a bad thing. The last, I guess the bumper sticker version of this to say is that Google Fiber looked into doing telephone service, saw the enormous stack of regs they would have to do that we've dealt with over the time, and decided not to do it. And now they just do VoIP. And it's because that system was written for a different era, a different place, a different competitive, technological, competitive, social era. And by putting the burden saying, well, then show me why we need to go through that page by page and don't need to do that, I think would be a huge mistake.
Oh, you know, there are, we could really go into a black hole here of talking about these things, but let me just say, one way of telling the story is to say, we were regulated different than Europe. We have better, faster, cheaper networks. Therefore, the regulation was the cause. Yeah, maybe. There's a different way of telling the story, which is that in the late 50s and early 60s, America, which has a kind of certain entrepreneurial class, had a bunch of folks who started to do cable in rural areas, and this became very popular among a certain population. And then in the 70s and early 80s, America regulated a bunch of other companies, specifically the broadcast companies, the electric utilities, and the phone companies, for the benefit of the cable companies. And they engaged in certain kinds of very, well, from their point of view, onerous regulation. The Pole Attachment Act, I believe, of '78, some of the copyright issues in terms of the broadcasters. And the cable industry grew, and it grew in the United States very differently than it grew in Europe. You know, my major criticism of Yochai Benkler's report is, which I thought was actually very good on a number of levels, but just not that relevant to what we were trying to do. But the one thing he kind of missed, and it's like missing the whole thing, is the importance of cable in the structure of the United States. And so it's not really about Title I or Title II. It's about the history that we had 2 wires prior to satellite coming in, because Europe depended on a lot more on satellite for video delivery. So when the era of broadband came in, they didn't have that second wire in as many places. So I'm just saying, you know, there's a lot of different things that lead to other things. Sometimes it's very difficult to figure out what's cause and what's just correlation.
I would actually absolutely agree with both points. I think a tremendous advantage the U.S. has is that we started with 2 sets of wires, basically. And so, I mean, where you start from makes a huge difference on, you know, what sort of path you want to take forward. You know, if you only have limited DSL available in your country, then maybe a highly subsidized fiber build-out might make sense. At the same time, I do have significant reservations, very similar to Christopher's, about even opening the door to Title II, the way that changes the necessary steps before innovating within the network. And I think that 706 is a proper framework. We'll leave it at that.
Christopher, you get to wrap up here for us.
Before, all right. So what's interesting is there is an interpretation, I do mention in the study, that we got cable for video, not for broadband. And so thinking about it in terms of the causal impact is questionable. What's fascinating is, I would say 2 things, is that one is Germany and Spain actually had very, very late cable and somehow managed to grow it very, very rapidly at a time where we would not expect them to do that. And people say, oh, well, cable's not going to build that anymore in Europe. That's not obvious to me. You know, one of the things I hope to do is to dig more into the German and Spanish stories to find out what happened. Because against all odds, Denmark and Netherlands got great cable, but it's kind of subsidized. There's a different story. But they had a private-led entity, and I think we can learn something by digging a little deeper. The other thing I'd say is, if you read the study, and at the risk of getting academic on you, one way to deal with Blair's concern is, if you look at the regressions, is to look at cable not as a driving variable, but as a control. And if you look at it that way, controlling for the existence of cable, what you still find is service-based infrastructure sharing, service-based competition still has a negative impact on coverage. And so even if I were to take that, your point seriously, reinterpreting the study still suggests that there is an adverse impact behind the European approach to regulation that explains at a statistically significant level why, a good part of why they don't have the coverage that we do in the US.
Okay, well, let's thank our panel. The time has now come for questions. I assume you're all ready for cold calling if necessary. Necessary. We got one in the back. Hold on. Wait till the mic gets to you. And could you identify yourself, please?
My name's Emilio Gonzalez with Verizon. A lot of discussion about Google Fiber. I'd like to know a little more. Specifically, is it subject to build-out requirements as other cable providers have to do in order to acquire a franchise? And I know it's limited deployment, but what is its track record thus far in serving low-income minority neighborhoods? And what is the price point?
In cities where it's operating, it is not subject to the same build-out requirements that were required of others. And I know you have, and your company and some others have made that point. Here's what you guys conveniently forget. The build-out requirements were applied to those entities that were granted a government monopoly, protection from competition. That is a fundamental economic deal that enables the build-out requirement. I assure you, if you could provide Google that same kind of monopoly that Verizon got back in the days when it was 9X, or that AT&T got back in the days when it was the original AT&T, or that Comcast got when it got the original franchises, I assure you Google would be happy to build that everywhere.
Since Fios was not a monopoly, is not a monopoly.
Sure, no, but Fios was built on the platform. Look, if you guys were to do Fios today, I think the cities would treat it very differently, and I think you would have a lot more freedom to do this. But you didn't have to build Fios everywhere in your service territory. You chose to build it in certain places where the economics made sense. You guys have applied the term cherry picking to Google, which is both factually wrong, but also ignoring Verizon's own cherry picking, if you will. And I wouldn't use that word, but if you apply the logic, others would apply it to you. You chose not to build in those cities where it didn't make sense. Well, that's perfectly fine from my perspective, but It does seem to me that there is this, and I feel very strongly about this, that criticism of Google is wrong on the facts in terms of history. It's wrong on the economics. And most importantly, you have to understand the consequences of that argument. If what you're arguing is that nobody should be allowed to build out a gig network unless they build it everywhere within a jurisdiction, then what you're really arguing for is the status quo. And you should be honest about that. You should say, I want the status quo, or you should do what certain communities in Utah are doing. Apparently, they're striking a deal with a company called Macquarie, which is a big Australian pension fund, which says, we'll build a gig, and we'll build it to everywhere, but you have to apply a utility fee on everyone in the jurisdiction. Unlike other companies, I'm perfectly happy with, if a local community wants to vote for a public subsidy for a broadband network, I'm okay with that. I think if I was on the city council, I'd almost never vote for it, but as a principled matter, I'm for local control on that issue. But if you're going to criticize Google, you have to say, I prefer the status quo. I think that's better, which I could argue about that too. Or you have to say, I'm for a public subsidy. But I assure you, because we did this with the gig.u thing, if you require a gig to be built out everywhere, as a starting matter, it will be built out nowhere.
Well, don't hold back, Blair, okay?
So
And anybody like to?
I think we should give Google tremendous credit. I mean, they've really been innovative in how they approach this. Essentially saying, we're going to build a network, who wants it? And created an excitement and people lining up to do it, not promising it. It's just a fantastic business move. And people saying, so what will you offer me to make you the city? And they found, they co-located staff in the permitting offices. Now, I don't think that we should be bitter about, other companies who try to do this may be frustrated, but in fact, that has become the success path, where every other fiber build-out goes to these cities and says, this is how it's worked. We assume we're getting the same deal as a starting point. And in fact, they've cracked the nut in ways that we thought that we couldn't do before. They do demand aggregation, which is what they call. They're not going to serve a neighborhood unless a certain percentage of people agree. It makes tremendous business sense. It works really, really well. And I think that that's a tremendous innovation. And the other thing that's sort of flying under the radar, I don't think they called this. They did about a couple years ago, they called the full Google experience. It's vertically integrated set-top boxes, tablets. If you really want a discount of full, you actually get all their devices in ways that we have been fighting this battle about in the cable industry because they understand that this performs better. And in fact, I think that's a tremendously innovative thing that they've done. Maybe very few people can replicate it because they don't have the same devices they can do in the same way or not. But I think that it's the kind of experimentation that's created a new way to think about reaching fiber into places we couldn't get it before. I will go back to the idea, though, fiber will not reach everywhere. We're talking about 34 cities, it's just not. And so this is a great solution for certain places where the environment is right. We have to think about that not as, okay, that validates fiber as the idea that's going to build us out. It's not. It just won't work everywhere. And we have to be smart about this and think about it more flexibly.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that Google deserves a lot of credit in identifying this sort of business model, though also would echo a lot of Chris's concerns that fiber is not going to get us everywhere. At the same time, to your point, I think that there is some concern. I think perhaps it's been overblown, but coming from Kansas City, familiar with the neighborhoods that have signed up, and I do think that there is some concern that this could potentially magnify the digital divide, where neighborhoods that don't reach that sort of level of demand, who at this point, aren't interested for many of the reasons we talked about earlier, that they don't find it relevant to their lives, aren't interested in signing up for Google, and so potentially could see a lengthening of the digital divide. I'm assuming that Blair agrees.
Not a factual one. 90% of the fiber hoods in Kansas City reach the threshold. 17 out of 20 of the low-income fiber hoods reach that threshold.
Another question. If you can't see me because you're sitting behind the pillar, I can't see you and I can't call on you. So, yes, sir, in the back.
Baron Soka, Tech Freedom. So I'll ask the same question in two different ways. This is to get back to Blair's point about being constructive and going to the gym, so to speak. So Blair.
But you look like you've gone to the gym a lot, I gotta say.
Well, thank you. Been working on that. I mainly think about this stuff while I'm doing that.
Good.
Which is good inspiration. So Blair, what exactly would your list be, and specifically where do you think we should pick up where the National Broadband Plan left off. And Christopher, to put the same question in a different way, what did your cross studies tell you about Europe? Since it's a national experiment, were there differences in regulatory approaches there beyond just unbundling of the local loop that would tell us what is dangerous specifically about public utility regulation, or conversely, what would be a good idea, like having pole attachment rights for companies that aren't telcos or cable providers? What would you do to encourage deployment, especially based on your study?
Blair, you want to?
To try to do it in a shorthand manner, I think in fiber it's being led by the cities. In terms of spectrum, I actually think the government's doing a reasonably good job. We'll see what happens with the incentive auction, but I think there's a number of things in terms of licensed, unlicensed, and other things which are being productive. And increasingly, by the way, spectrum is created by fiber. That is to say, the Wi-Fi network is replacing the cellular network as the primary network by which bits travel, and that's a function of fiber. And a number of companies, including the cable industry, and there's some interesting technology that's making that much more effective. On the adoption piece, I would tie together numbers 3 and 4. What I would actually, if the President of the United States were to call me up and say, tell me in 30 seconds what I should do, I would say get legislation and by the way, if Congress doesn't pass it, just keep pushing it, and then they'll bear the burden. Create a base closing-like commission of 20 experts in IT that basically you do a once in a generation. Let's just rewrite the rules about how we do IT purchasing and IT in the federal government. Invite some states to go along, whether you look at healthcare.gov or the recent VA crisis. Those are not things that really should ever happen on a modern IT system. And so you basically have this commission spend a year, present to Congress a voted up or voted down kind of list of all the things that need to change. There was a high-tech CEO council that estimated that if we improved IT acquisition and utilization, we could save $1 trillion to the federal government over 10 years. Take some portion of that money and front-load it with a very focused, a kind of surge-like effort to do adoption in terms of the kind of training, Jerry, you were talking about, and basically say to people, if you want to be part of, if you want any federal benefit, you better be online, and you better be literate, and basically do this over kind of a 2 to 5 year period.
I like your idea of the base closing commission. I have previously suggested that for how we handle our spectrum problems.
Yeah, I agree.
So
yeah.
I would agree with that.
Chris, I think was
So did I learn anything from the country studies? The answer is yes. So one of the things that the EU system is supposed to do is define markets in a technologically neutral way. It doesn't. The EU officially says do not treat cable in the same market as telco provided broadband. And so it ends up doing some very strange things. First of which is they unbundle all fiber. Just because they see them as a dominant player. They put fiber in that market but don't put cable in. And in fact, they end up, there are 11 countries who actually do include it, and one, which is Denmark, where cable is owned by the telco, they actually started unbundled cable. And you're starting to see some very interesting things. On the flip side, Austria has now defined wireless broadband as being in the same market as fixed line broadband. And they've got basic data that looks at those interactions, and that, I think, is a more productive thing because they actually can look at how people are using it and make decisions like that. And so consequently, these causes you to see monopolies where there are no monopolies, where you're facing vigorous competition from cable just because telcos look like they have the whole thing, and can make you see non-monopolies where there are real problems. The other thing I would say is there's one other aspect which I think is really interesting, which is they're talking about shared conduit systems. Rights of way is something we don't often talk about. They're absolutely critical. And especially what they call in apartment buildings the verticals, is that if you get into the basement, it's easy to put a fiber termination modem in there or some kind of it. Then you got to get all the wires to the individual apartments within it. That's what they call the vertical wires. The verticals are now increasingly being shared in Europe, because no one wants multiple wires from the basement into your apartment. And that is either, in my opinion, best owned by the apartment building and done on some basis, but in many places it's owned by the telephone company, and having access to that becomes absolutely critical. And so on the flip side, finding something like, no one's making huge amounts of money on that. I mean, it's just that's not the point of that, of the verticals, but that is an area where I think they've done some innovative things to actually make it easier to lower switching costs.
Okay. Thank you. We got some more questions. Got one here.
Hi, Marcus Hedenberg, Broadband Census. This question is for Christopher. First of all, I happen to be Swedish, so I have an axe to grind with you. But no, my question is, I've never had anybody really explain to me what exactly next generation access is and how it works, and what makes it better at reaching out than fiber to the premise.
Next generation access is defined by the EU as 30 megabits service to the home, technology neutral. And the EU has set as a goal as 100% 30 megabit coverage by 2020. There's been an interesting set of debates that they're saying that the counting horse race issues are distracting us from the important stuff, and that just building it out is that people are thinking, how well do we think this? They also set targets of 50% adoption at 100 megabit coverage. And people are seriously questioning that. Now, in practical terms in the study, they simply call all count as NGA all fiber to the home, all DOCSIS 3 cable, and VDSL capable of meeting 25 megabit service. In fact, 2 countries, the UK and Belgium, do not report all VDSL regardless of what speeds it's achieved, and another 6 countries where they were unable to audit and verify whether in fact that's the case. So the numbers are kind of messy, but they're largely defining it in technological terms. And I think it's an example of what the problem is that if you set it as a goal without really having data to understand why it's a goal or what it's going to be, and set it as 100% coverage across your whole country, it could be that you'll forego benefits where you could achieve benefits from higher service in higher areas, urban areas, and spend a lot of money chasing rural areas that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so, in fact, Sweden, if they insist on 100% coverage, that last 15%, and especially the last 5%, is going to be extraordinarily expensive to serve. Because they're in the upper north regions and the inner regions of Sweden, and I can't see any way that they're going to be able to do that cost effectively without resorting to some fixed wireless or satellite-based solution.
You have no sympathy for the Laplanders?
I have tremendous sympathy for the Laplanders. I'm one of these people who've watched Frozen more times than I care to think about, and so I listen to the Joachim thing. My wife looks at me and says, "You're hardly the target demographic for that movie," but But these are hard problems. And I think that Sweden has made a tremendously brave move, and we are learning from it, and they've achieved certain things. I think that the 6% rural coverage is a reason for some pause. And what you're starting to see in different countries, which they've been on a firm fiber strategy, they're starting to say, maybe we should think about different strategies for different areas. And I think that Sweden hasn't done that yet. I think they would be tremendously well served to think a little bit more broadly about the way they're going to achieve their goals.
Can I just give some numeric demonstration of the point that Christopher just said? When we were doing the National Broadband Plan, the question was, how do we get 4 down, 1 up, which was the standard we use, which, by the way, I'm glad the FCC is rethinking it because it's something which should be reviewed periodically. But to get that to basically 100% of the homes, there were 7 million homes that didn't have it, which is out of 110 million. That would cost $34 billion. That would produce $9 billion of revenue over a 10-year period. So that left, I'm sorry, it left a hole of 24. So I guess it was 33. It had it produced 9 of revenue, 24 billion, 14 billion of which was the last 250,000 homes. So it's less than like 0.1% would cost more than 50% of the universal service needs. So
I love the idea of these metrics need to change, what gets involved, and I love doing it based on data. The thing that I worry about is, in fact, I learned about universal service in Germany and in Europe. They actually have a series of things that are included in their universal service obligation. 2 of the things are payphones and white pages, to this day. And what's fascinating is the benchmark is 50% of people use them. And in fact, what happened was the minute it hit the 50% threshold, the entire debate changed and it became about some sort of other social goals other than actual utilization. And so if we're going to use data and make decisions, we need to mean it and understand that, in fact, the white pages are an extraordinarily expensive way to distribute that information that's already out of date by the time it gets to your home. And that, in fact, we need to be, we should ideally build in real data-driven ways to actually adjust our expectations in ways that actually yield real benefits to people.
I say a word about universal service. I often told my students the truly universal service in America is television. Over 99% of households have television. I say truly universal because there's more U.S. households with televisions than there are with indoor plumbing. So, which is 98%. So. Another question? Am I going to have to start calling? No question, Rebecca? Okay. Thank you.
Questions, I'll say
Okay.
something, because I like Jared.
There you go.
This is just following up on, is this not turned on? Following up on the adoption discussion for people who are really caring about it, and two comments. One is, and thanks Blair for the acknowledgement of the part that we're playing it. We go to the gym every day on this issue. We really do, in the sense of the Internet Essentials is hard, daily, on the ground effort to get hard to reach families signed up. And I think over time, in some ways it gets harder as you're hitting the folks that are just traditionally, historically more resistant. In some ways it should get easier as more and more services are getting online. But one of the things that I would commend people to is a study, an empirical study that John Horgan did, who worked for Blair in the National Broadband Plan, looking at some of our families that are on Internet Essentials and trying to tease out what were the things that were working and what were the things that weren't working to get them online. One of, not surprisingly, but good to have it confirmed empirically, was a lot of it was tied to people's schools, people's family situations, people's neighborhoods, the social group you were in. So the surrounding context was in some ways the biggest driver of whether people were crossing that line or not. But it's a good study. If anybody wants it, let us know and we'll send it to you.
That's a very good point, I think, because there's one thing we should learn from this experiment and from the Google experiment is let's record this, because it's the first time we've really taken a serious look at this. Let's get the data, let's get the stories, what works, what doesn't work, because right now we don't know, and that's good. So I'm glad you guys are doing that.
So one of the things I learned about the UK is they actually have a project where they're trying to connect the entirety of 2 cities. And I got this a lot from John Crowcroft, who's an engineering professor at Cambridge. He's fabulous. And they're doing some things that are pretty radical, which is, for example, they're using prioritization. They're trying to get people to open up their Wi-Fi hotspots to other people's traffic. And they do it so they offer it on a secondary basis. That is, if you're using your connection, you get it. But if you're not using it, it's available for other people. And we'll give you a discount off your service if you do that. And they extend that out. The second thing they're doing is they're trying to do a map of where those people are, and they have to keep updating that map. And they're looking for public facilities, schools, libraries, where they can fill in the blank spots. And then the second, and they're doing some very innovative things that require them to do things that, to a certain view, are non-neutral. It's prioritizing traffic in certain ways. The other thing that's fascinating is they have innovative ways for designing, overcoming obstacles of who's served and who's not. And one of the things that they really found is that there's a bunch of families where the parents would say, I don't want internet because if I get an internet connection, my children will not come see me on the weekend anymore. And that's honest. And oddly enough, in Britain, you'll understand this, it tends to be Indian families. And actually what they've decided is they've simply declared people who have it available and have the education and have the physical the financial means to purchase, they're simply declaring them served and getting over it. Because worrying about how to get them to adopt because of a personal family situation they have is like beating your head against the wall. It's like saying, you must here, you must take. It doesn't make any sense. And so in a way, thinking flexibly about people and why they're doing it has yielded some pretty interesting solutions, including when to call it a day and that the adoption for certain communities and families isn't really the obstacle that we need to be solving as a society. It's just a choice they're making about how they organize their lives.
We're getting close to the end. Would any of you guys like to sum up? Add some additional stuff? Blair, I know we can count on you.
Well, I'll kind of following up on, recently Singapore invited me to come visit with them to talk about, I mean, I find this to be amusing because they lead in so many different things, but they're very impressive because they're constantly trying to think about what's next. But I started with a pop quiz. I'll end with another very easy one. So I go to Singapore. As I'm leaving the men's room in the airport, there's a little terminal that just says, how clean was the bathroom? And you just hit, you know, a real smiley face, a kind of smiling face, a neutral face, right? You just ping it. A week later, I was flying out of Baltimore to Chicago, and as I was leaving the bathroom, I noticed this sign: "We take great pride in the cleanliness of our bathroom. If there's any problem, call this number." Here's the question: which bathroom do you think is cleaner? That's actually not fair. Everything in Singapore is cleaner, and it has nothing to do with the technology. But it is also true that when I left the passport office at Singapore, as well as in Beijing, there was that little terminal that you immediately said how good was the service. And the passport service in both Beijing and Singapore was significantly better than when I returned to the United States, because there's immediate evaluation. This is not a technology problem. It really goes to what Peter Drucker said, is that the great challenge in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it's to respond with yesterday's logic. And it seems to me that as we think about the meaning of these things and how we make change manifest in the world, the government response is still very much steeped in yesterday's logic, and that's the primary thing we have to change.
Doug, would you like the last words?
I don't think I can add much more on top of that.
Then I'll close. If I were to leave with a plea in this going forward, is for database decision making. What scientists and scholars do is we generate testable hypotheses, and we test them. And I often talk to a student who really seems entrenched in a position: what data could I show you that would make you change your mind? Sometimes the answer they say is nothing. I hate the record industry, and nothing you can tell me will change my mind. And I tell them, you are entitled to that point of view. We are no longer having an academic conversation. We're having a political one, or an ideological one, or a religious one, but there's no purpose to this exchange anymore. And I understand there are moments in this town where it is that, but where we can contribute to making policy improve is to ask yourself on any proposition, what data could I see that would change your mind? I was in Sweden, seeing a presentation where they forecast fixed line. I hear constantly, you know, we need 100 megabit. Wireless is not a substitute. DSL is dead. You know, we hear all these autopsies or predictions of the future. What they put up is a prediction of fixed line versus wireless subscriptions projected worldwide through 2020. Fixed line almost dead flat. Wireless going like this. And maybe it's not a substitute for the things we know, but that is an important graph. That maybe substitutes the wrong word. We need to understand that, because in a lot of this, the future is, wireless has a very important role in the future that we don't know about, that we're not seeing, because we're not seeing the data, because people are often opposed to the idea of wireless being an important something in our life because of some other thing they're serving. And so there was a boss I loved where I could ask him, what data can I show you could change your mind? Good bosses, when you show them the data, they change your mind. Bad bosses don't. And my reaction is the way we get forward in this is, when I tell someone that Swedish coverage isn't that great, some people just say, well, no. And I show them facts, and instead of showing me facts, they simply choose to disbelieve what I have to say. And there's a lot of ways we can have an exchange that would push things forward. Just blanket refusal to deal with data, to me, is not a productive one. And that I would encourage all of us to think about facts and to think about what our premises are, and to ask ourselves what we could see that would make us change our minds. Because, you know, we talked about, I think Google has made a lot of us see that world in a very different way. We need to understand the scope of that opportunity. I think what we're doing with DSL, all of us, we thought DSL was on the way out. Project VIP is now rolling out, where they're delivering somewhere between 45, 75, in some cases 100 megabit service through the old copper telephone network. And in places where it's fully deployed, it is taking subscriptions away from cable for the first time. And that is a tremendously valuable thing, where basically one company throws the gauntlet down and says, it's your turn. And we saw this, how, you know, cable made DSL deploy, which made cable upgrade, and we see this go back and forth. And that's a tremendously virtuous cycle that I would like to see us preserve. And that we should actually make sure that we look at real facts on the ground, instead of talking about what someone's vision of what they think the future should look like, irrespective of the facts.
Well, I hope you all learned as much as I did from these three gentlemen. Let me